We begin with incredible, shocking news out of Syria. A possible chemical weapons massacre by the government of President Bashar al-Assad, with casualty estimates ranging from more than 100 to more than 1,200. The latter figure, if confirmed, would amount to one of the greatest war crimes of the past several decades. NBC News cannot verify the authenticity of the amateur video we are about to show you. It purports to show victims of the attacks. It contains images of injured adults and children that may be considered disturbing.
This morning, Syrian rebels tell us there was a series of what they claim were chemical weapons attacks. 10 villages at least to the east and north of Damascus, hit by what rebels say were surface-to-surface missiles fired by the regime and tipped with chemical weapons. The death toll, well over 1,000. Symptoms before death, witnesses tell us, were shortness of breath, constricted pupils, foaming at the mouth. We've seen videos posted online showing many women and children among the dead. The Syrian government has denied categorically that it was responsible for this attack, denied that it used chemical weapons.
That was NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel reporting, who will join us in a moment. It should be noted that the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which operates out of Britain but employs a number of contacts inside Syria, so far confirms 136 deaths as a result of this morning's attacks. It says the massacre stands as the most violent military assault of that particular area since the beginning of the uprising. As we continue to show you this amateur video, it should be noted that much of it we choose not to show because it contains uncovered bodies, many of them children. But this still photo captures a sliver of the horror. Syrian citizens trying to identify the dead bodies of children in the town of Arbin in Damascus. We've blurred the faces in this picture. More amateur video captures smoke rising in the aftermath of the bombings. Meanwhile, the stance of the major powers in regard to this conflict seems largely unchanged. The Russian government accuses the rebels of unleashing the attack themselves as a pretext for currying favor with the UN Security Council. The United States says the Syrian government should facilitate the United Nations team of inspectors.
Suffice it to say, though, that the use of chemical weapons is something that the United States finds totally deplorable and completely unacceptable. And those who are responsible for the use of chemical weapons, if it's determined that that's what happened, will be held accountable.
A United Nations chemical investigation team arrived in Syria just days ago, part of a 14-day mission to investigate claims of chemical weapons in other prior attacks. And today, the UN Security Council held an emergency meeting. All of this, amid a whirlwind of news out of Egypt, already in a state of tremendous tumult and on tenterhooks. With its former president, Hosni Mubarak, set to be released from prison ahead of a retrial, there are worries about further violence in a country that has, of course, seen recent crackdowns against pro-Morsi rebels and awful reprisals against Egyptian police and Christian civilians and places of worship. Joining me now is NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel. Richard, what do we know, what can be confirmed about the awful, awful, awful images we are seeing out of Syria today?
We've spoken to medical personnel, we've spoken to Syrian activists in these areas where the attacks allegedly took place. Clearly something happened. They believe it was a chemical gas attack. That around 2:30 in the morning, there began a barrage of surface-to-surface rockets, first firing into the eastern suburbs just outside of Damascus. That lasted for about an hour, with apartment buildings being hit. Initially, people thought that it was just more of the standard shelling that is very commonplace in the war in Syria as we've been seeing it. Then casualties started showing up in the field hospitals. People started talking about chemical weapons attack. Then the casualties started flooding in. Civilians, women, children, people who'd been in those apartment buildings. After about an hour, the attacks shifted to the northern suburbs just outside of Damascus, and a very similar pattern unfolding in those same areas. We don't exactly know the death toll. They range from hundreds to well over 1,000. But the kinds of stories, the kind of injuries, the kind of deaths that were suffered are fairly consistent in the videos. We can't authenticate the videos because they were posted independently by people who are supporting the revolution in Syria. But they seem quite they seem very difficult to fake. We've also shown them to independent experts, chemical weapons experts, who thought they were consistent with a non-conventional weapons attack.
So what does this mean? The president has talked about a red line, and he's been very careful and couched when discussing a red line to talk about mass casualty events, to talk about systemic deployment. If we are seeing something like this, if it is confirmed, it seems to me is the most systemic mass attack deployment of chemical weapons. What does that mean for the red line the president has noted?
This would be a totally different scale of events. In the past, we've talked about chemical weapons being used to kill 1, 2, 5 people in numerous attacks. That always struck observers as a bit strange, more of a terror tactic than a tactic of war, using a limited amount of chemical weapon to scare your enemy instead of creating mass casualties. If this, in fact, is confirmed, this would be a different kind of attack. Some of the rebels were talking about well over 1,000 killed. As you mentioned in your intro, if that's confirmed, it's one of the worst war crimes, one of the worst atrocities carried out anywhere in the world in decades. The president talked about having a red line. If this is confirmed, not only is it crossed, that red line has been jumped over.
NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel, thank you. Joining me now is author, journalist, and MSNBC contributor Rula Jibril. Rula, you've spent some time in Syria with the rebels. We've talked about this issue. You and I have both been, I think it's fair to say, skeptical of the efficacy of U.S. intervention. What is your reaction to the images coming out of Syria today?
This is more than a red line. Richard Engel is right. This is a moment where we need to show the regime that something will be done if he will continue. If he uses these weapons, he has to be held accountable. This guy has to not only leave, he has to relinquish power, and he has to actually give the UN access to all of these sites, because God knows who can access these sites further. I mean, if it's a failed state, you can have anybody. And we were, as you said, skeptical because there's within the Free Syrian Army this element that is very Islamist. What if, in a case of failed state, there's these sites and who have access to these sites are these kind of Islamists? We need to intervene now before then ever. Here's where I watch this and I think two things. What we've seen today, again, if confirmed, we have to say that we cannot verify the video, but it does. The circumstantial picture certainly looks like something truly horrific. It looks like Iraq. It looks what Saddam Hussein did in Iraq to the Kurds. Let's remember, and to the Iranians, when there was a war between Iran and Iraq, Saddam Hussein used chemical weapons. And these are similar image to what we used to see coming from Iraq, from the Kurdish area and from the Iranian area.
This is the incident Halabja in 1980 in which Saddam Hussein used chemical agents against the Kurds.
Exactly. Now, you know, he's gaining, in the battlefield, he's gaining ground, and he's winning Assad. And his allies in the region are helping him. Iran, Hezbollah from the other hand. And he's looking at Egypt, and he's thinking, you know what? They toppled the president. We had Islamists winning. It didn't succeed. And now back to the old regime. Even Mubarak is coming back. So why I shouldn't fight in all kind of ways?
So you think Assad is making a calculation as he looks at the regional picture saying, actually, this Arab Spring, this wave of revolution, we're now seeing retrenchment. I can hold on to this. I can stick this out.
Exactly. Also because he sees confusion by the West. We weren't able to call a real coup for days, and till now we're not even cutting the aid from the Egyptian after they killed thousands of protesters. Look, Assad is the most Machiavellian dictator in the region, and he's looking around him and he's making a very hard calculus, saying, okay, I tested the chemical weapons. Nobody protested. Now I'm testing it in a bigger scale.
Okay, so let's say that is the case. Let's say that those initial reports, which were very small scale and kind of baffling in their deployment, we now see something, again, if confirmed, a mass attack, a war crime.
A war crime.
A war crime. What is the response? Because you and I have both talked about the dangers and unintended consequences of arming rebels. We've talked about the fractious situation on the ground there. We've talked about the al-Qaeda affiliated elements that are part of the rebel group, the Free Syrian Army. We've talked about the possibility of blowback, the difficulty of control. So what does any kind of escalated U.S. intervention or accountability or punishment for crossing the red line look like?
Look, we have to think about it this way. What is the least worst option that we have today? To leave the situation like this is not an option. The real option today is really to push and not to leave before things are fixed, to push on the international community, convince the Russians. The Russians will not stand up to this.
No.
The Israelis will not stand up to this. Before we intervene, the Israeli might step in and try to intervene themselves, because this is, threatening their areas, threatening the Golan Heights and other areas. And there's already communication between the rebels and the Israelis.
The thing I worry about the most is the idea that that there is a sequence of testing here about how far and what he can get away with, and if this is allowed. At the same time, it is an absolute no good options situation.
No, look. If Assad will leave, we know from now that this war will carry on for many years, let's put it this way, because we know that there will be retaliation, there will be a failed state, and there will be an Islamist element within it. But we have to understand that there is no solution until the Syrians, all of them, write a social contract where everybody is included, minorities especially, women, Alawites, Kurds, everybody inside that deal. That have to be done now before we enter the region.
We are very, very far from that. MSNBC contributor Rula Jibril.
Thank you for having me.